Hello again, and welcome to the Interchange Book 3 video for Unit 3. Now, today we're going to talk about indirect requests. Alright, so let's get started. Okay, so again, let's look at a specific situation with this girl, Lisa. Now, let's look at Lisa's problem. So, Lisa woke up in the morning before she had to go to class. She felt very sick, so she texted her friend Daniel to ask him for a favor. So let's listen to the conversation between Lisa and Daniel.
Hey Dan, I don't think I can come to class today. I'm feeling sick.
Oh, I'm sorry, Lisa. That's too bad.
Thanks. Can you do me a favor? Can you tell the teacher that I can't come today?
Yeah, for sure.
And if you get a chance, can you ask him what the homework is for next class?
Okay.
And can you also ask him if the quiz is next class?
Definitely. No worries. Feel better.
Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. See you later.
Okay, so after talking to Lisa, Daniel goes to class in the morning, sits through the class, has a normal class, but now we're going to look at the conversation that he has with the teacher after class. So later, after class, this is the conversation that they had.
Hey, Daniel, good job in class today.
Thanks, Mr. Parker. Hey, I wanted to talk to you about Lisa.
Yeah, that's right. Where was she today?
She told me that she's sick.
Oh, that's too bad. I hope she feels better.
Yeah, I know. Anyway, she wanted me to ask you what the homework is.
Ah, okay. Well, can you tell her to study for the quiz next class?
Okay, what should she study?
Would you tell her that the quiz is over Unit 3 and 4 of the book?
Okay, sounds good. Anything else?
Yeah, can you tell her not to be late for class? We're going to do a review for the quiz during the first part.
Alright then, I'll let her know.
Okay, thanks, Daniel. See you next week.
See you then, Mr. Parker. Have a good weekend. Okay, so after watching the video, we're going to look at the grammar that we used in the video and the dialogue and the conversation between Lisa and Daniel and also Mr. Parker. So first, let's look at something called direct speech. So direct speech is when one person says something directly to the person that they want to talk to. So that's called direct speech. So for example, if Lisa said, "Hey, Mr. Parker, I can't come to class today," that's direct speech. But Lisa couldn't do that. She couldn't talk directly to Mr. Parker, right? So instead, she had to use an indirect request. So basically, an indirect request is when you are passing a message. So if we remember that Lisa didn't talk to Mr. Parker, first she talked to Daniel, right? And then Daniel went and he told Mr. Parker, and he said, "Hey, Lisa can't come today." So what is it that Lisa said to Daniel so that he would go and pass the message to Mr. Parker? That's the grammar we're going to look at. That's called an indirect request. And this is what it looks like. Lisa says, "Can you tell Mr. Parker that I can't come to class today?" So this is the grammar we're going to look at today. Good. So before we look at the grammar, it's important to look at the different types of messages that we use often. So there's three basic types of messages. Let's look. We have normal affirmations, and an affirmation is just a normal sentence. So Lisa says, "I can't come to class," right? That's an affirmation. And Mr. Parker says, "The quiz is over Units 3 and 4. So those are two normal affirmations. We have imperatives, like mandates. You can think of those as orders. So for example, Mr. Parker says, study for the quiz, and don't come late for class. Now, you can notice that these are imperatives because I have no subject. I just use my verb, study for the quiz. Or the negative, I use don't, for example, don't come late for class. Again, there's no subject, so that's an imperative. Now, we also have questions. That's a type of message I might want to pass, is I need to ask a question. So a direct question is, what is the homework for next class? That's what Lisa said. Or is the quiz next week? Again, that's another type of question. So we need to think about these three types of messages when we use our grammar today. Good. All right, so let's look at the normal affirmations and how we make indirect requests with normal affirmations, right? Normal sentences. So if you remember, Lisa said something. She wanted to talk to Mr. Parker, but she couldn't, right? A direct message is, hey, Mr. Parker, I can't come to class. But remember that she couldn't do that. That she had to talk to Daniel first, and then Daniel had to talk to Mr. Parker. So what Lisa says to Daniel, the message she passes to Daniel, is what we call the indirect request. So let's look how she does that. She can use can or could and would to ask nicely. And she can say, can you tell Mr. Parker that I can't come to class? Right? So notice that the message doesn't change. It's just the question I put before this. So can you tell Mr. Parker? Could you tell Mr. Parker? Or would you tell Mr. Parker that I can't come to class? And that is optional. You can use it or you cannot use it, and it's totally okay. Now let's look at the other thing. Now Mr. Parker wanted to say something to Lisa. So remember, a direct request or a direct message is, hey Lisa, the quiz is over units 3 and 4. But remember, Mr. Parker couldn't do that. That he had to go to Daniel and say, Daniel, can you tell Lisa this information? Again, that's whatever Mr. Parker says to Daniel is the indirect request. So let's look at what he said. Again, he says, can you tell Lisa? Could you tell Lisa? Would you tell Lisa that the quiz is over units 3 and 4? So again, when I use a normal affirmation, right? For example, I can't come to class. The quiz is over units 3 and 4. Nothing changes in the indirect request. The only thing I have to think about is using this type of grammar. Can you tell this person that? Or would you tell that person? And then you give the message, right? Good. All right, so now let's look at the imperatives, right? When we use a message that's an imperative, again, an imperative is a mandate. It's an order, right? So if we think Mr. Parker, right, his direct imperative is to say, hey, Lisa, study for the quiz, right? There's no subject, so we see that that's a imperative. Study for the quiz, Lisa. But remember, he couldn't say that to Lisa. He had to pass the message to Daniel, and then Daniel went to Lisa. So the thing that Mr. Parker says to Daniel is the indirect request. And how do we do this for an imperative? Well, let's look. So Mr. Parker says to Daniel, he says, can you ask her, right? Her is Lisa. Or maybe could you tell her, or would you ask her, right? We can use ask and we can use tell, both for the imperatives. Asking if it's nice, telling if it's like an order. But Mr. Parker says to Daniel, he says, can you tell her to study for the quiz? Okay. Now let's look at another one. If Mr. Parker says, hey, Lisa, don't come late for class. That's an imperative. It's a negative imperative. Now, what is Mr. Parker going to say to Daniel? He wants to pass that message to Daniel and then to Lisa. So he's going to say, well, hey, Daniel, would you tell her not to come late for class? Okay? So notice we're changing this verb a little bit, right? It's not just a verb alone. We have to. And if it's negative, we use not to. So what we call this is the infinitive. we use the infinitive, right, when we are using an indirect request for an imperative, okay? So when you pass the message, you need to change the verb into the infinitive when it's an order, okay? When the message is an order, use the infinitive. So can you ask her to study for the quiz? Or maybe could you tell her not to come late for class? Good. So last we're going to look at questions, when the message that we pass is a question. So remember, a direct question is something like what Lisa says here. She says, hey, Mr. Parker, what is the homework for next class? But remember that Lisa couldn't do that. She couldn't talk to Mr. Parker. She asked Daniel to ask Mr. Parker a question. So we're going to look at the grammar for this, okay? So she says, hey, Daniel, could you ask him, and that's Mr. Parker, could you ask him what is the homework for next class? But wait a second. This is not correct, okay? It looks correct, but it's not correct. And this is why, okay? If you look, okay, at this question, we have, what is the homework for next class? So a direct question always uses my auxiliary and then the subject, just like this. So what is the homework for next class? That's a direct question. But wait, before that, I also have a direct question. I have, could you ask him? That's a direct question. And another direct question, you know what? In English, we can't do this. We can't have two direct questions together, okay? So it just is something about English that you can't do. So you say, well, then what do we do? Well, the answer is that we need to use an indirect question, okay? So to do this, right, I need to change my direct question into an affirmation, right? So the affirmation of this question, for example, is the homework for next class? The affirmation starts with the subject, and the affirmation is the homework is for next class. So this is how I'm going to make an indirect question, okay? So I'm going to move this up so you can see. And this is the correct way to say it, with the affirmation form of the question. So could you ask him what the homework is for next class? And that's good. That's correct. Notice that the second question is not actually a question. The grammar and the structure of this sentence is not a question. It's an affirmation because I use the subject first and then the auxiliary. So just remember, you need to change the question into an affirmation, and that becomes your actual question. That becomes the message, okay? Okay, so another example. So Lisa says directly to Mr. Parker, she says, hey, Mr. Parker, is the quiz next week? But remember, she couldn't do that. She couldn't talk to Mr. Parker, so she needs to ask Daniel to ask the question to Mr. Parker for her. So again, she starts with a direct question. She says, could you ask him? And then she uses a different type of thing. She says, if, or maybe she could say, whether or not, right? And then the question, is the quiz next week? But wait a second. Wait. If we remember, I have my auxiliary first, and then I have my subject. Now that's a direct question. Remember, we can't use two direct questions, right? So I need to think, all right, so what's the affirmation of this type of question? Is the quiz next week? Well, start with the subject. So the affirmation is, the quiz is next week. So that's the affirmation. And remember, this is the form that I'm going to use. So I move this up. Okay? So the correct way to ask this is, could you ask him if the quiz is next week? Or could you ask him whether or not the quiz is next week? So if you're thinking, well, what's the difference between if and whether or not, right? First of all, I need to think that the direct question is a yes or no question. If I have a yes or no question, I'm always going to use if to represent that it's a yes or no question, or whether or not. Now, the difference between if and whether or not is that when I use whether or not, it's because I have an idea that maybe that the quiz is next week. So maybe Mr. Parker said something last week. He said something last week about it. He said we're going to have a quiz probably, and I just want to verify. I think the answer is that yes, we do, but I want to verify that that's for sure, that that's positive. So that's what the idea of whether or not is. It's like saying yes or no, right? I think that you said it's true, but I want to know if it's true or not. Okay? So that's when I use whether or not, is if I have an idea that what I'm asking is true. Okay? So remember, for the questions, don't use two questions. The second question has to be in the affirmation formation. Good. Alright, so to finish, let's just review indirect requests. So remember, the request is the first part of the sentence. That's the part where we're asking for something. So we say, can you tell him that? Or could you tell her? Or could you ask her? Or maybe, would you ask him? Or could you ask him? That's the request, right? And then the message is what we want the person to do. We want the person to say this for us, or ask this for us. So let's look. The normal affirmations are pretty easy. Nothing changes. We just use the normal message and the request. So, can you tell him that I can't come to class today? Pretty easy. The imperatives and the mandates, what you have to remember is that the verb, you need to use the infinitive form of the verb. So we say things like, could you tell her, or could you ask her to study for the quiz, or could you ask her not to be late? So we're using the infinitive, or the negative infinitive, for the imperatives. For the questions, it's the most difficult. Why? Because we have to take a normal question and we have to change it. We have to use the affirmation. So remember, the affirmation is when I use the subject first and then the auxiliary verb. So for example, would you ask him what the homework is for next class? Again, the subject and then the auxiliary. If it's a yes and no question, I use if and whether or not. So for example, could you ask him if the quiz is next week? Or could you ask him whether or not the quiz is next week? So this has been a video to hopefully describe how to make indirect requests, which are basically just passing messages. So I hope this was helpful. I hope you learned a lot. Good luck, and thanks for watching, guys. Bye.